So welcome everyone to our November Facts and Snacks, trans and non-binary survivor-centered services in the big city and in small communities. Before we get started, just want to remind you all here with Zoom, you have some options. If you would like to turn on the closed captioning, you can do that on the menu that's usually at the bottom of your screen where it says live transcript or CC. We will be sending out, in our follow-up email, we will send out the transcript of today, as well as the chat if folks are wanting that too. And Michael, our presenter, is sharing a whole variety of links and things with us, so we'll make sure we include those in the follow-up email as well. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michael from Forge.
Cool, thank you. And that was nice and quick. I was imagining this long, like, here's how you use Zoom. So great. Hello, everybody. It's really good to be with you in our different time zones and our different daylight savings time, non-daylight savings time shifts. So I am going to get us started because I've got a lot of content that I hope that we can get through and play a little bit together as we go along. So the agenda that I've laid out for us today is to just briefly tell you a little bit about who Forge is, who I am, a little bit of Trans 101 and some kind of reminders about who trans folks are, which hopefully will be mostly review for people. We'll spend a bunch of time on trans victimization statistics and how that relates to rural communities. We'll look then at some current cultural kind of climate issues because we're living in a world that's kind of challenging right now. We'll then move on and talk about trans-specific barriers to accessing services, IPV-specific services, and then we'll end with what you can do and hopefully a few minutes for Q&A.
And Michael, I'll just interject one thing that I did forget to mention. For all of you, if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat. And if you select all panelists and attendees, then everybody else will be able to see your question if you'd like. Otherwise, it will just go to the panelists. Either way, we'll make sure those get filtered to Michael throughout the webinar.
Perfect. And that's basically what I was going to say next. So perfect timing. So chat, you have the rules and the road there. So that's one way that we'll interact today. We have 2 polls, which Brandy is going to help pull up because I can't. And then we're going to have potentially some time for voice interaction if that feels more comfortable than through the chat. I always want to remind us all to take care of ourselves. I use the same image with all of the trainings that I do, just as a reminder to me and a reminder to you all that if you need to check out, if you need to leave, if you need to crawl under your desk, if you need to put on music, whatever it is that you need to do, please take care of what you need to do. Interaction is obviously optional because you need to take care of yourself. So play with us if you'd like. Don't play if you don't want. All of those good things, and we'll send out PowerPoints with all of the links and stuff afterwards. So just a really quick sentence about who I am. I'm Michael Munson, the Executive Director of Forge, and the title doesn't mean anything because we have a really small staff and we all do what we need to do to get the work done. And we are all really passionate and full of life and good stuff. So let me give you a quick thumbnail about who Forge is. So Forge was founded by me and one other person 27 years ago, which seems like forever and just yesterday. At the same time, we are a trans-focused organization that exclusively focuses on anti-violence issues, predominantly intimate partner violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, which I just kind of said, dating violence and stalking, as well as hate-motivated crimes. About 25% of our time is with direct service. And because we're a national organization, that means usually online direct service. And about 75% of our time is doing training and technical assistance like this. We have 2 guiding principles. One is about being trauma-informed. That's both with the work that we do with the survivors that we work with, as well as with you all as providers. And the second guiding principle is to be empowerment-based. And again, we look at that as something not just for the work that we do with survivors, but also in the work that we do with you. We want to make sure that you leave feeling good and more confident after you leave a training. This is just kind of one of those, like, it should go here because if if you want to connect with us and we want to connect with you, social media is really the place to be these days. So please feel free to like us, friend us, do those kinds of things, and we will try to do that back. Like I mentioned, we have a really small staff. We've got six of us who are the core staff, plus a bunch of consultants. We do span the map, central in Wisconsin, and then on both coasts. Okay, so let's look at some brief reminders about Trans 101. And this will be really, really brief. If you need to have more, I can help direct you to other resources, and I'm sure other people on this call can as well. So I wanted to start out with just a basic reminder that no one's identity is a disorder. This was a phrase that Lynn Fraser used many years ago at a trans conference for professionals working with trans folks. And it's just something that we need to keep in mind, I think, as we move along, that when we're looking at trans people, sometimes the media and medical establishments pathologize trans people. I encourage all of us to not do that. And I think most of us are pretty clued in about that. So one of the handouts that I use a lot, because it's really simple and it kind of covers all the bases, is the gender unicorn. So, and it's in the chat because we've got a sew together back-end staff. Thank you. So just really quickly, when we look at the gender unicorn, it has this, this unicorn, which is great. And it looks at what gender identity is, which is what's on the inside. So we all have a gender identity. It's what gender we are, what gender we feel we are, what gender we embody. Gender expression is what we push out to the world. It's what the world sees us as. It's how we dress, how we walk, how we talk, what we literally present to the world. Those two things are different from sexual orientation or romantic orientation. So who we're attracted to, who we love, who we have sex with, who we partner up with. And all of those things are different than the sex that was assigned at birth. So usually we don't know about chromosomes or anything else when we're born, but a doctor or a midwife or somebody says, oh, look there are genitals that look like this. So we are going to assign this person an M or an F on their birth certificate. So that's the really quick, here's kind of who trans people are, about what people's gender identity is, what their gender expression is, and that's oftentimes different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. If we can pull up, Brandy, if you could pull up the first poll, that would be super, please. And as a presenter, I can't see it. So if you would take a moment and think about what percentage of the population is transgender, what would you pick? 0.6%, 1%, 1.8%. I'll give folks just a couple of seconds to respond. And just for the back end folks, I can't see what's going on. So if you want to close it when it's appropriate and show the results, I would appreciate that.
Absolutely. So it looks like we have 21 out of 23 folks have voted. So I'm going to end polling right now and go ahead and share the results.
Excellent. Cool. So look at that. So there's this kind of, well, there's no bell because there's no up and down, but fewer of you said 0.6% and a lot of you said 1.8%. Thank you so much for participating. So the really good news is that you're all right. And we're all kind of wrong because we don't really know what the answer is. So you're not wrong, but it's all right. So we know that someplace between 0.6% of the population and greater than 1% of the population is trans. We don't know for sure because we don't have that question on the census. We can't find that answer out. We can make guesses through some logical statistical methods and all of those good things that researchers do, but we don't really know. Lynn Conway is a researcher who's looked at things in a more complex way, and so has definitely leaned towards the greater than 1%. When we take that, I don't know why this happened last time. You're supposed to see the pie and you're supposed to see the 1% up in the corner. Imagine that in your head. And you're supposed to see other things in the other categories. What you would see in those blue and purple ones are trans men and trans women, and you would see 29% and 33%, and then non-binary is the biggest piece of that pie. So the important part that I'd like you all to remember is that when we're looking at sexual assault or domestic violence services, a lot of times we segregate services. So when we have a population that is the biggest piece of the pie who identify as non-binary, so people that don't identify as male or female, it really puts people in a difficult position about what kind of services they'll be able to access or feel comfortable accessing. One more little piece of data on just how many folks are trans. We are definitely seeing a trend of increased numbers with trans youth, with youth that are identifying as trans. So different studies have even said that up to like 9.2% of youth are identifying as trans. So I think that we're going to continue to see that swing. We're also going to continue to see the swing of more and more non-binary people versus folks who transition from male to female or female to male. So again, we use the 1% of the population is trans. It's good for math, which you will see here. So if the population of Colorado is around just under 6 million people, 1% of that is 58,000 people. So you for sure have met a trans person walking about because there's a lot of trans folks in Colorado. And just a reminder too that trans folks live in urban areas and trans folks live in rural or smaller communities. We all know that language matters. When we talk about survivors or victims, when we talk about lots of things, we know that the language that we use matters. So a long time ago, somebody asked me to come up with this word cloud, and it's got 100 different words that are trans related, their identities. So I don't expect anybody to see the little tiny words on it, but I just want folks to keep in mind that language is always evolving. It's really complicated because language is complicated, but it's also really, really simple. When we're working with people, when we're talking with people, as long as we're reflecting back to them the language that they use, that's the simple part. And it's oftentimes messy too. So evolving language, complicated language, simple language sometimes makes for a big mess. And we say, oops, and I'm sorry if we've made that mess. But know that it can be messy sometimes. So this slide dates me a little bit, and those of you who are probably above 40 or above 50 will recognize Bugs Bunny and the Abominable Snowman. And Bugs Bunny is getting non-consensually hugged. We won't go to that part, but the Abominable Snowman is saying, I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him and call him George. And so the reminder to us is that we are not all named George. We are not all the same pronoun, and we aren't going to know what somebody's name or pronoun is or are unless if we ask people. So pronouns really do matter. It's important to listen, to ask, to use, to put up signage if that is appropriate in your organization, like post-COVID. But pronouns really do matter. And they matter not just because it shows respect, but it also dramatically decreases the suicidality and the depression that a lot of trans people are feeling and experiencing. Throughout today, I'm going to be showing some photos. All of them we have permission to use. Almost all of them have at least one survivor represented. And Forge uses photos mostly because we know that providers sometimes think that they don't know what trans people look like. And I say that really carefully. But I want to remind us all that trans people look like everybody else. And we all look different, and also that trans people can really be vibrant and resilient. Let's move on and talk about national data. So the preface with this is that for a lot of trans folks, like a lot of non-trans folks, victimization is lifelong and it's oftentimes complex. So we know that trans young people and adults experience higher rates of multiple forms of violence. So sexual assault, intimate partner violence, hate-motivated crimes, mental health challenges. So not a victimization, but mental health challenges, especially depression, anxiety, and suicidality, and substance use, just to name a couple of those things that get linked with victimization. And what we're going to talk about today is going to be more about the adversity and the barriers, but I want us all to remember that trans folks are resilient too. So we're going to look at some of those adversities, some of those barriers, and we're going to end today making sure that we all remember what those resiliencies are for many trans folks. So I'm going to start us with kind of an age-related thing, starting at a younger age and then moving to adulthood. When we look at the data that we know from kids that are K through 12, We know that a lot of them are leaving school due to violence against them because they're trans or non-binary, and many of them are getting expelled. So when we look at this chart, there's 23% that are getting expelled or leaving school due to violence. And that means that those kids are likely going on the street. They're likely possibly getting kicked out of their home as well. And I think that it's a kind of a logical assumption that the people that are moving to the street are going to experience more violence and more different types of violence than if they were more safely at school or more safely at home. When we look at the implications for rural communities, we know that, not all schools are going to have anti-bullying policies, and not all of them are going to enforce those policies. So more rural communities may be less likely to have those policies in place. There might just be a lack of trans knowledge by teachers, by school districts, and parents might be a little bit more opposed to other trans kids, like letting their kids play with trans kids, setting up play dates, things like that. Again, just because of lack of knowledge. Not true for all rural communities, but there's a little bit of a trend that goes that way. I'm going to very briefly just go over resources. So this is a resource that is really excellent for looking at school districts and making things more trans accessible. So it was written by GLSEN and the National Center for Transgender Equality. When we move on and look at data around sexual and intimate partner violence, this is one snapshot, and this is a snapshot based on multiple studies. So when we look at trans folks who've experienced IPV, it's roughly 50% of trans folks that have experienced intimate partner violence. And the rate for sexual assault is even higher, roughly 66%. We know in some subsets of that population, it moves even higher. In some populations, obviously, is a little bit lower than that. But this is a substantial number of folks that are experiencing sexual assault or domestic violence. If we play out the numbers again, so we take the almost 6 million folks in Colorado, that means almost 60,000 trans folks. And if we multiply that out, what that ends up meaning is that around 29,000 trans people have experienced IPV in Colorado, and around 38,000 have experienced sexual assault. Let's move on and do poll number 2, please.
One moment, Michael. I'm trying to launch that.
I was being very patient. Hopefully I did not look or sound impatient.
No, I was in my technology's not doing what I want it to do mode. All right, here we go.
Excellent, thank you. So the question is, trans women or trans feminine folks experience more intimate partner violence than trans men or trans masculine people. So true, false, or the rates are the same? What do y'all think? And Brandy, when there's a good number of respondents, if you want to share the results, that would be cool.
Absolutely. We have results coming in really quickly. Right now, we're up to 83% have voted. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, share the results.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so majority of you think that trans women or trans femme people experience more IPV than trans men. Some of you think false, some of you think the same. So about the same numbers for the false, and the rates are the same. Excellent. Thank you for participating. So the interesting data is that what we're seeing, again, through multiple studies, some of our studies are ours and some of them are other folks, is that the rates of childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking are almost the same for trans feminine folks and trans masculine folks. So again, that doesn't really take into consideration non-binary folks, but it's in that big spectrum of those gender vectors. So this is one of those things that oftentimes surprises advocates, and it surprises a lot of us because we live in this world where we learn from a very early age that women are victims, men are perpetrators, and we oftentimes don't see the folks who don't fit that presumptive paradigm. So again, we're seeing that those rates are pretty equal across most of these typical crimes that many of us deal with day to day. So a little bit of a rural implication with this is that, if somebody has experienced partner violence, they may have fewer places to seek support or services. Some of the agencies might be, broader in scope and cover multiple areas of crime. Not saying anything that you all don't know. There can be obviously concerns around survivor confidentiality with some dual roles or dual relationships in smaller communities, kind of like everybody knows everybody's business and people may not want to go to a place where they know people. A reference here is this guide, which is really a fantastic guide, and it talks about the FIPSA, which I can never remember when I'm in the middle of a webinar, so the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And just about every shelter and a lot of SADV agencies receive funding from FIPSA. So if you do, it may be a great resource to go check out to make sure that your program is in compliance. When we move on and talk about assault by healthcare providers, this should, I hope, shock people. I'm not doing it for shock value, but it's really quite shocking that 1 in 10 trans people have experienced sexual assault by a healthcare provider. 1 in 4 has experienced physical assault by a healthcare provider. So think about if somebody has experienced sexual assault within an IPV dynamic. Is that person going to go get medical care if they need to? Are they going to go get forensic medical care? It's not likely. So there's a lot of things that are going on with this slide in terms of violence should not be happening by anybody to anybody, but certainly not by healthcare providers to their patients or clients. So this is really, really shocking information, but something as providers that we need to know about why somebody might be experiencing resistance, even when we know that they should probably get medical care because they're injured enough for medical care, or it would help them if they sought services. So again, when we look at a rural, kind of the considerations around rural communities, there may be a limited access to a wider range of providers. I mean, clearly there's going to be fewer providers in more remote areas versus in larger cities. And those providers may not be trans-informed or trans-sensitive. There might be a financial inability by some folks to travel to other providers that are more trans-savvy or trans-informed. And because there are small communities, there might be some hesitance to report abuse about a provider, again, because everybody knows each other's business, all of those dual relationship issues that happen. When we look next at negative interactions with law enforcement, some of the things that I want to make sure that you are seeing here is like people are getting called the wrong pronoun. That doesn't start out a great relationship with law enforcement if somebody's reporting or if somebody's getting pulled over because they were speeding. When people are not treated respectfully around their name and pronouns, things don't go well. A lot of times people are asked invasive questions by law enforcement. And just like any other profession, law enforcement can be the perpetrators of sexual assault or physical violence. So again, just another piece of data that reminds us that trans folks don't always feel comfortable with law enforcement. Again, just like many other folks don't, but there might be a little bit higher end and a little bit more complicated ratio with trans folks and law enforcement. And so when we look at the rural implications, generally, there are fewer law enforcement officers kind of per capita, per geographic range. There might be less cultural diversity training. I know most law enforcement officers, even in large urban areas, get like 10-minute roll call videos and very minimal training. So the folks that are in more smaller communities are going to get probably even less training than those in larger cities. It's also possible that folks will have less contact with trans individuals, just again, due to population and community size. One of the resources, there's actually a set of resources that we worked with the Vera Institute of Justice on a couple years ago, is a set of resources for law enforcement as well as for advocates who want to bridge the ties better with law enforcement around trans and lesbian, gay, and bi folks. Let's look at homelessness for a second. And I'm bringing up homelessness because a lot of times trans folks cannot access shelters, shelters for IPV. So when we look at really large national data that had almost 30,000 trans respondents, at some point in their life, 30% experienced homelessness. So again, that's pretty profound as well. So large sample, 30% of folks had experienced homelessness at some point. 26%, again, in general, from this large sample, avoided shelters because of fear of mistreatment. And that fear is really well-founded, because those who did seek shelter, 7 out of 10 were mistreated. So they were physically abused or assaulted, sexually assaulted, harassed, discriminated against, all of, this whole pile of things. So again, really profound with that. And another reason why people may not want to access shelter, as well as the shelters maybe not wanting to accept trans clients. When we look at street economy work, it's important to know that a lot of trans folks end up doing street economy. So 20% end up doing street economy work, sex work, selling drugs, exchanging things for housing and food, things like that. And again, we can take that back to what happens in childhood. If they were kicked out of school, kicked out of home, what are people doing to survive? What if there's employment discrimination, which there is? What are people doing to, literally put food in their mouth? When we look at that 20%, 86% were harassed or attacked or sexually assaulted or mistreated by law enforcement. So again, the rates of abuse go dramatically higher when people are engaging in sex work or engaging in other street economy. So just the reminder about homelessness and shelter and street economies, it happens in rural areas too. No shock there, but I think sometimes we think it's only a big city issue. So street economies happen, looks a little bit different in rural communities, but it still happens. It may be more underground. It may not be as visible to people kind of walking around the world in rural communities, but it's still there. And another option, or another bit about the pieces of shelter, a lot of rural communities may not have homeless shelters, may not have IPV shelters. So again, like, where are people getting access? Are they feeling comfortable to access shelters? Are shelters welcoming trans folks into that space? So HUD has gone through some changes over the last 2 administrations. So for a while, HUD became very restrictive of housing rules and regulations around trans folks. And now it's swung back to being more inclusive and requiring shelters and folks who provide shelter services to be more inclusive of trans folks. Another resource that people may want to check out is the National Center for Transgender Equality, who has a list of resources on housing and homelessness. Let's look at drug and alcohol use. Again, I'm bringing this up for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of survivors do end up using drugs and alcohol for a coping mechanism, and a lot of trans folks, with or without abuse, use alcohol or drugs for coping mechanisms. So you can see on the slide that trans people are like 3 or 4 times as high as the general population for drug and alcohol use. So again, higher rates of substance use for survivors anyway, anytime. And in rural communities, there may be things like social activities that center around food, or community gatherings which include alcohol. So there might be just an inherent nature of having alcohol in spaces more frequently because of the types of gatherings that people are having. And this is the second to last slide on data. So we will move off of data really quickly. This is another one of those slides that makes people's jaw drop. So when we look at suicide attempts from the general population, it's around 5%. When we look at the trans population, the suicide attempt rate is 40%. I skipped a slide that shares a little bit more of what happens when people have reported sexual assault or domestic violence or abuse by teachers. And that rate goes from 40% up to 76%. So this is really profound. And I think it's just one of the things that I'd like you all to know about when you're working with somebody, that they may have had a history of suicide attempts or suicidal thoughts. They may use drugs and alcohol to cope, and they also experienced this form of victimization that they're coming to you about. Last data slide is the rate of polyvictimization that's happening within trans communities. So this is something that we were really shocked about. This is from our data, that we thought that the data was wrong because we asked people to just check the boxes of if they had experienced hate-motivated crimes or IPV or adult sexual assault. And we found that a lot of people checked multiple boxes. So what's on the screen right now is, like, if we look at IPV, it says 76%. Well, 76% also experienced another one of those crimes on that list. So again, when somebody's coming into your office, because of IPV, it's really, really likely that they've also already experienced another form of victimization. So that might be raw, it might be healed, we don't know what it is, but just know that people are coming in likely with prior victimization. So all of this kind of implies that there's a lot of interconnectedness. There's a lot of things that go across the lifespan. There's a lot of things that we didn't talk about, like the intersections around race and nationality and sexual orientation and disability and all of these things that can change these rates of data, generally higher, not lower. Let's take a breath, maybe, because that was heavy and intense. And let's look now at another heavy and intense area, which is what's going on in our culture, what's going on socially, politically, culturally. And I'd like to just kind of plant this idea that we're looking at things right now in our culture as kind of these three bodies of legislated hate, sanctioned hate, and emboldened hate. And there's also good things like love going on as well. But when we look at the hate part of it, it's really got enmeshed with a lot of different things, and it's become very political and it's become very pervasive. And I think a lot of us are feeling that really directly. So by legislated hate, I mean literally creating laws that are anti-trans or anti-pick another demographic, but we're talking about trans folks today. By sanctioned hate, what I mean by that is that people are getting told that it's okay to hate. So, I give you permission to, to feel hateful to somebody. And then emboldened hate, by that, I'm meaning that people are kind of following the leader. They're saying, it's okay, I can do that because this other person is doing it. So they feel powerful in their ability to express their hatred and their discrimination. So we have some of this going on kind of just all the time as a main undercurrent right now. One of the things that has changed in our culture over the last couple of years is that there was a lot of federal anti-trans discrimination a few years ago. And I can let you fill in the blanks about what was going on a few years ago. And now a lot of those things have been reversed, and there's not as many negative anti-trans pieces that are happening on a federal level. But what's happening is that it's moved to the state and local level. So the question that I have to you, and this is an open question because I don't know the answer, but you all probably do, is, in the rural communities in Colorado, I'm presuming that it's more conservative leaning, at least looking at these political maps, rural communities are. But some of the questions are counties or school districts enacting laws or policies that might be anti-trans? Is there other stuff that's happening in those communities that the observer would not necessarily know unless if they're living in that space? One of the resources that I really, really love is the equalityfederation.org tracker. And if you don't know about it, it's a really cool thing. It's nonpartisan. They put up all the things that are assembly bills or Senate bills in different states. And the really cool thing about Colorado is that there are currently seven bills that are introduced, and none of them are anti-trans. So way to go. That's really, really, really good. When we scroll back and look at the federal level things, one of the things that happened early on in the Biden administration was this introduction of a toolkit on trans equality. And this is an interesting collection. It collects multiple different jurisdictions and groups, so it does Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, Title IX. It does a whole bunch of different things, and it shares what the laws and policies are. So it's a good place to start if you care about looking at the federal level legislation. So let's drill down a little bit and look at some of the current events and how it's affecting trans people and trans survivors in particular. We know that a lot of people are living in a lot more fear these days. And for trans folks, this means, there's a lot of fears around safety. And that can be safety on the street, safety in communities, safety around things like housing security or employment security. Bathroom access is still a huge issue for folks. So, can I safely use a bathroom if I go out in public? There can be some increased family tensions because of those political implications and the cultural norms that are shifting. And there has been an increase in hate-motivated crimes. And that impacts intimate partner violence, hate-motivated crimes pulling into that, as well as the other way around. We're also seeing things like mirroring. So people are hearing national leaders or celebrities say anti-trans things, really horrific things. So like Dave Chappelle the other couple months ago said something really, really transphobic. So we as a culture are hearing those things. And what a lot of perpetrators do is take on that language and bring it into the home. So they're mirroring that anti-trans language that they're hearing by the people that they know and like and respect. So trans folks are ending up re-experiencing those words in the public discourse in a number of ways, by hearing it directly, by hearing it from their abusive partner. So again, we can look at that emboldened or sanctioned hate there. We also know that the Black Lives Matter movements and some of the other movements around immigration and lots of the things that are happening, reproductive rights, are impacting trans people because trans people are people, but also because if folks want to go and protest or rally about those things, that police misconduct is a concern for folks. I'm just going to leave it at that because I think a lot of us know exactly what's going on with the rallies, the protests, the law enforcement that are being abusive in some cases. Many of us know too that COVID-19 has really had a dramatic impact on folks who are experiencing violence at home. So people may be spending more time at home with their abusive partner or family members. They may be surrounded by kids or adults that are abusive or loving, but that abuse is ranking up for a lot of folks. There can obviously be some increased financial dependence because of COVID's impact on job security and maintenance. And there can be some other strings that are attached that can be used against one partner or the other. When we look at some rural implications of this, it can be harder for some folks to get away from their perpetrator in smaller communities because there are less places to go. That may or may not be true in every community, but I think that's one of the common things. Another thing about COVID in this is that we can look at Colorado, which has a 62% rate right now of people that are fully vaccinated. So 2 shots, maybe a booster, maybe not. So it might be harder to get access to places that are connecting one person to another, depending on what the rules around masking and social distancing and stuff like that are. Number 5 of the current events and how it's changed things for trans survivors is just the instability of the world right now. And again, true for everybody, but I think a lot of people that are trans are really scrambling to take some actions that they aren't ready to take. And that might be changing their name. It may be starting on hormones or having surgery when they're not sure if that's what they want to do because they're worried about what's going to happen legislatively in the future. That instability can make anybody depressed and suicidal, which is happening for a lot of trans folks. And trans folks might be holding on to anything. And that includes their partner who might be an unhealthy relationship. We look at rural communities. We know that laws can be changing rapidly. We know that things can be changing rapidly, that uncertainty is happening just as much in rural communities as it is in urban communities. The 6th and last thing that I wanted to share with you about kind of the current events and how it's impacting folks is around coping mechanisms. So we talked before about alcohol and drug use being higher for trans folks. That rate has gone even higher now with COVID. So people are isolating, they may be drinking or drugging more because they're isolated, because they're experiencing more abuse at home. Lots of reasons for that. Trans people may be choosing to isolate. So not about COVID, but choosing to isolate because the world feels like a worse place and not a safe place. We're also seeing people taking increased risks. So increased sexual risks, increased relationship risks, increased risks like driving fast or maybe not using protection with sex, things like that. Within trans communities, we're also seeing that horizontal hostility, the hierarchies of, I have it worse than you, my abuse was more harsh, all of that stuff, which is not helping people connect to each other and feel supported and cared about. We're also seeing that people are detransitioning. Nothing wrong with detransitioning, but people are doing it because they feel that they will be safer. And that feels like a problem to me. And many folks are increasing their use and access to weapons. And that's true across the country as well. So we're seeing that rise in trans communities. Y'all know what your gun laws are, or you can find out. So I'm going to skip the majority of this slide, but we know obviously that when there's increased access to guns, there's increased homicides in IPV, or increased suicides for folks that have guns in their home. So let's look a little bit at barriers. So barriers to accessing victim services and what some trans folks are concerned about based on research. So if we could start in the chat, I would love to hear your ideas about what are some of the barriers that trans survivors might face when trying to access domestic violence, intimate partner violence services. So what do you think? Thank you for putting the question there. So what are some of the barriers that trans survivors might face in accessing services? No right or wrong answers. Fear that our services are not for them. Yep, the big kind of them in the big quotes. Trans survivors will have concerns about having their names and pronouns honored while asking for help and seeking legal assistance. Yes. What other things do you think about when you think, well, if a trans person's coming for services, what might they be worried about? Whether it's your agency or just, thinking about another agency, what do you think of some of the barriers? That they will experience more harm rather than getting the help that they need, being judged. Assault, discrimination, and neglect in healthcare settings. Yep. Fear of being blamed or not being believed. Exactly. Gender stereotypes creating less likely to be believed. Yeah, all of those things. Lack of capacity and diminished availability. Yeah, those are great. I'm going to let people keep on going. So I'm going to read a couple more as they come in. So fear of multiple social locations, not being seen. Is that forced to be out without choice? Yep. Further victimization by law enforcement. All of those things. You can keep on typing. I'm going to share with you 10 of the things that we know based on research are concerns about accessing services by trans people. So a first concern is, will I be turned away? So will I literally, get to a crisis center and I will be not allowed to come in, literally physically not allowed to come in, or will people say, nope, we can't help you here because we don't help your kind? Another concern is, will I be safe? So this is not just, will I be safe from my abuser, but will I be safe from other residents, other clients, other staff, from the victim service providers, in-house or broader, from the neighborhood that it's in? And again, I'm not talking about good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, but will I be safe taking the bus to get to your organization because I'm a trans person and people, read me as a trans person and people are discriminating against me based on what I look like? So will I be safe is a whole big bubble of things that could be many different aspects. Another concern is, will staff know about and be sensitive to me as a trans person? So is there some base level cultural competency that people can expect when walking into an agency? A fourth concern is my identity documents don't align with the gender that I live in. Will I be not denied access to services, discriminated against, or harassed? So a lot of times trans folks don't have an ID that says the gender that they are presenting in the world. So if they have to show ID, which is true in some places, not in others, people worry that they will be turned away. People are very concerned about being misgendered. So being called the wrong name, the wrong pronoun, many different things that can go along with being misgendered. A sixth concern is, will someone out me? Can I have agency over my own story and my own life? Number 7 is, will I have ample privacy? So this is oftentimes more about shelter or places where people may be getting undressed or sleeping, in single bedrooms, double bedrooms, things like that. So, it's a concern for everybody, but trans people and trans bodies may have a little bit greater desire and need for that physical privacy. Number 8, will I have to report my abuse to law enforcement? So again, reminding folks that it's our job to remind folks that they don't have to report to law enforcement. I'm not going to talk about mandated reporters, but that's a concern that a lot of trans people have. Number 9 is, aren't these services just for women? So we've talked about that, right? That there's this paradigm that women are the victims, men are the perpetrators. So if somebody doesn't identify as female or as a woman, they may worry that they can't access the services that you provide. And the 10th one is, I'm ashamed and embarrassed about what happened to me. Will staff make me feel ashamed about being trans on top of what happened to me? So those are 10 things that are really, really common themes for trans folks thinking about accessing DV or SA services. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do to improve trans survivors' lives. So what I'd like us to think about is kind of the opposite of microaggressions. So the microaggressions are those things that people say or do that are usually unintentional, that are really hurtful. So micro-inclusions are things that are like small steps to include somebody, to welcome people in. So on a bigger scale, micro-inclusions are these symbolic actions that force us to recall the humanity of others. So I see that there's stuff that was continuing to go on in the chat. Yay for that. So let's switch gears in the chat and let's talk about what are some of the things that you can do to improve services for trans survivors. What can you do? It can be little, be big. I'd aim for the little. What can you do to make things better so that trans people can access your organization or a peer organization? Ask and use proper pronouns. Mention your pronouns when introducing yourself. Yep. What else can you do? You as a person, you as an organization, you as a community, on a team of folks. What else can you do? Clear public information about who can seek services. Listen, check microaggressions in self. Yep. Inclusive language on websites and flyers. Yep. What kind of goes out to the public? Mentioning trans issues in social media posts, showing inclusion of interest. Yeah. What else? Creating safe space in all ways. Yep. We have rainbow flyer on our door. Those are great ways to do things. Gender neutral restrooms. Yep. Be a safe place for trans folks to work, intern, volunteer. Exactly. Yep. Yep. Those are great answers. Keep those coming. I'm going to go on and share some things that might not have been mentioned. You all captured many of the things. I'm going to share 7 things that that I know are things that are free that y'all can do to make life better for trans survivors. One is to believe survivors. Believe all survivors, of course, but remember that when a trans client comes in, they may not have been believed by a lot of folks before reaching your door. So believing survivors is really essential. When we can stay person-centered or issue-centered, somebody's coming out to us for a specific reason. When we can stay centered on what they need, we are going to do really well with that trans client. Doesn't matter how much we know about trans issues, if we stay person-centered, if we listen, if we reflect, all of those good things that most of us know how to do, that we were trained to do, we'll get it right. We can, as many people have mentioned, use name and pronouns because pronouns matter. We can introduce ourselves with our own pronouns and name. We can ask people about theirs. We can make intake forms more inclusive to include pronouns, all of those good things. We can have accessible restrooms. So all gender restrooms are ideal. If that's not possible in your building or location, you can have signage that shows it's inclusive. There can be an organizational culture issue that goes with this to make sure that everybody in the organization feels okay about all gendered bathroom spaces, about that signage. We can also do things like accompany somebody. So in a legal setting, if we're at a courthouse, we can say to somebody if they need to use the restroom, I'll walk down the hallway with you and I'll wait outside the door. Those are the things that we can, do to make sure that people are not having a lack of bathroom access be a barrier to receiving all kinds of services. A couple of people mentioned social media. We can definitely schedule social media that goes out that's trans inclusive. Might be once a month, might be once a week, it might be whatever time frame is useful to you, but make sure that something goes out to let people know that you're inclusive of trans folks. We can do things like see and affirm resilience. And that can look like a whole bunch of different things. A lot of times when people experience life in a kind of a tough way, in a hard way, people are not seen for who they are. They're not seen for the resilience that they embody. So I'd like to take a minute and just share a kind of an interlude. It's a video that was made last year. It was made by a group of folks here in Wisconsin. And we've had a lot of things going on with trans youth in sports, and that's been going across the country as well. And this video was made in response to that. So let me share this with you, because this is one of those things about how can we uplift resilience.
I learned that practice pays off.
I learned the value of hard work.
I became a part of something bigger than myself.
I wasn't great in school, but baseball and eventually softball motivated me to really work hard.
I never played college ball. I never went pro. But through mushing, I got to be part of something.
I learned how to win and how to lose and how to keep going either way.
I grew stronger.
I grew more confident.
I met some of my best friends.
I had fun.
I treasured those memories.
I hope all kids get the chance that I got.
I hope every kid in Wisconsin can be part of a team.
Trans inclusion is important to me. I coach kids in soccer that are gender fluid and non-binary. My kids are on their team, and those are just their teammates to them.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, deja a niños que jueguen.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
I just want to play with my friends. Bye.
So I just saw in the chat that there was no sound. Is it true that there was no sound for everybody?
I was able to hear sound, Michael.
Okay.
Looks like some folks did and maybe some folks didn't. Apologies if you didn't have sound.
Yeah, I'm sorry too if you didn't have sound. Okay, looks like some of you did. I'm sorry for the folks that didn't. I will send out a link for this too, because it is a fantastic, sweet video, and it does relate to victimization, because when kids can't play in sports, they're denied the access to, that positive feeling and team building and those developmental social skills and all that good stuff. So I wanted to share this too. This again is like seeing and reflecting the resilience of people. So this is a card, and again, this is a friend of mine who shared this with me, and the card says, "Dear neighbor, I wanted to give you a big thank you for hanging, it's a trans pride flag on your house. It truly gives me a sense of safety and pride in both the LGBTQIA+ community and in our local community. Happy Pride." So again, this is a reminder of like, what can we do to honor resilience? Well, can we put up a flag? And what does that mean? And how will we even know that it means anything to anybody? But it does when we hear things like this, or when we see the response of that. And just to kind of go full circle, the note was to Helen Boyd, who's a fantastic author, writes on trans issues, and her partner, Rachel Crowell, was the person that made the film that we just saw. So happy world there. Number 7 of the things that you can do free and easy is to be kind. So it sounds simple. It sounds kind of, well, it doesn't sound very academic, right? But it's one of those things that if we are kind to people, if we're kind to trans people, kind to trans survivors, it will go a really long way. I'm going to skip the resources for the sake of time. You're going to get them all in the follow-up email. And I wanted to leave the 4 minutes that we have left for a couple of questions if people have them, and any other space that people would like to use. So shut your eyes, I'm going to forward to questions. Are people wanting to comment or question or have thoughts about what we've talked about today?
And if folks would prefer to be unmuted, just put that in the chat and we can always accommodate that.
Yeah, sometimes it's a lot easier to say things than to write things. And if you don't have comments or questions, and I know you probably want to have a little bit of time to wrap us out and things, I would be curious about kind of a final question, if you want to share in the chat, about what is a small thing that you will do today or tomorrow or this week to improve trans and non-binary survivors' lives. So what is something that you can say definitively, I'm going to do this to make trans survivors' lives better? Be kind. Yay for being kind. It really does go a long way. Work on social media posts for Trans Awareness Week. Yes. So it's an excellent time right now. It's coming up to a sad day for many folks, Transgender Day of Remembrance on November 20th, which marks the people that have been killed due to anti-trans violence. But generally people look at that week leading up to it as Trans Awareness Week. So a perfect time to do social media or outreach. So I'm seeing some other stuff about facilitating an LGBTQIA+ survivors group. Yep. Excellent. Yeah, TDUR is one of the most important day of observance in the trans community. It definitely is. And to counter that, to look at resilience too. I mean, it's really important to honor those folks who have died, but it's also important on March 31st, which has become the Trans Day of Visibility, which is kind of like, I don't want to say it's the opposite, but it's really focusing on that resilience in March. Excellent. I really appreciate everybody being here today. It's good to virtually see you all and spend this last hour with you. So thank you. And thank you, Brandy, for doing all the heavy lift of typing in and putting in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And before you all log off, if you wouldn't mind, while you're typing your thank yous to Michael in the chat, I'm going to launch our little quick poll about this webinar. This is all anonymous, so feel free to give us some feedback. I will also send out a link so you can also offer some narrative feedback. I'm going to put that in the chat right now, but this will also go out in our follow-up email. Let me go ahead and put that in the chat as well. So that link in the chat is if you would like to type some narrative feedback, or if you'd like to answer the poll questions that are on the screen right now, you can answer them there as well. So thank you all so much. And Michael, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your just awesome breadth of knowledge. It was so much and so amazing. And sounds like everybody in the chat has really enjoyed it too. So thank you.
This was fun. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling. Maybe my screen's working. Okay, there we go. All right, so thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Thanks for joining us today. And keep an eye out for the December Facts and Snacks announcement that will go out later this week. Miranda and I will be talking about the DDP requirement, how we can support you doing some more equity and anti-oppression work. So be on the lookout for that in December.